The wind in Wyoming had teeth. It bit at Mara Quinn's cheeks. A dry, dusty cold that promised a harsh winter and offered no apology for the brutal summer just past. She stepped down from the stagecoach, her boots sinking into a fine red powder that coated everything in the town of Copper Creek. It was less a town and more a temporary argument with the vast, unforgiving landscape. A single street, rutted and scarred, was flanked by a dozen sun-bleached wooden buildings that leaned against each other for support. A horse trough leaked a steady, dark patch into the dirt. A wagon sat abandoned by the livery. One of its great wheels splintered and collapsed, looking like the bleached bones of some long-dead beast. Mara clutched the handle of her worn leather satchel, the cool metal of the latch a small, solid thing in a world that felt frayed at the edges. She, too, was a thing in need of mending. At 27, she felt as weathered as the buildings before her. The journey from Nebraska had been long, each turn of the wheels grinding away a layer of the woman she had once been, leaving behind this quieter, more cautious version, a nurse and a teacher. The letter of introduction in her bag said, "A woman of good standing." It did not say she was a woman whose womb was a barren field, scorched by a fever that had followed a brief, tragic joy. It did not say she was a woman running from the pitying eyes of neighbors and the constant, aching emptiness in her arms. She had come west looking for a place where her past was not common gossip, a place quiet enough to let the ragged edges of her life scar over. Copper Creek, with its biting wind and its broken-down wagon, seemed to understand the language of things that had been left behind. She walked toward the general store, its sign swinging on one hinge. The words Olson's Mercantile faded but legible. Through the grimy window, she could see an oil lamp flickering, its flame struggling against a draft. A tiny point of light in the growing dusk. Another broken thing, she thought. Another life fighting to stay lit. Her goal was simple. Find a room. Find a position. Perhaps tutoring the children of a local rancher or acting as a town nurse if they needed one. She wanted nothing more than to earn her keep, to be useful, and to feel the silence inside her fill with the small, necessary tasks of the day. The clang of a hammer on steel rang out from the blacksmith shop at the far end of the street, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat for the town. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. It was a comforting sound, a sound of purpose. She was halfway to the store when the rhythm broke. There was a sudden, violent hiss, a sound like the world drawing a sharp, angry breath. Then came the explosion. It was not a boom so much as a deafening shriek of tearing metal. The blacksmith shop erupted in a cloud of black smoke and steam. Shards of wood and iron flew through the air. A woman screamed. Men shouted. For a heartbeat, Mara was frozen, the dust settling around her in a slow, silent fall. Then, her training took over. The shock receded, replaced by a cold, clear calm. She dropped her satchel and ran toward the chaos, her worn skirt kicking up clouds of red dirt. People were pouring from the saloon and the mercantile, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. The front of the smithy was gone, a gaping hole breathing smoke. The blacksmith, a burly man with a soot-blackened face, was stumbling out, clutching his arm, his eyes wide with disbelief. But Mara's gaze swept past him, scanning, searching. Her eyes, trained to find the smallest sign of distress, landed on a small heap near the splintered wall of the shop. It was a boy. He lay still, half covered in debris, his face pale against the red earth. She was at his side in an instant, her fingers going to his neck, feeling for the steady, thrumming pulse of life. It was there, fast but strong. Thank God. She gently brushed debris from his body. He was young, perhaps 10, with a shock of unruly brown hair. His shirt was torn, and a long, angry burn was already beginning to blister on his forearm. Worse, a piece of twisted metal, no bigger than her thumb, was embedded in the fleshy part of his upper arm, a dark stain of blood spreading around it. "Someone get me clean water and cloth," she commanded, her voice cutting through the rising murmur of the crowd. "And the doctor, if you have one." A woman hurried back toward the mercantile. A man mumbled something about the doctor being out at the Miller place, not due back until morning. It did not matter. Mara knew what to do. She worked with a focused grace, her hands sure and steady. This was a world she understood. Torn flesh, pain, the body simple, desperate need to be made whole. It was a language she spoke fluently, a comfort in its brutal honesty. She carefully tore a strip from her own clean petticoat, folded it into a thick pad, and pressed it firmly against the wound to slow the bleeding. The boy groaned, his eyelids fluttering. "It is all right," she murmured, her voice low and soothing. "You are going to be all right. Just stay still for me." Just as the woman returned with a bucket of water and some rags, a man emerged from the crowd. He moved with a quiet purpose that made the others step aside. He was tall, dressed in dusty denim and worn leather, with shoulders that spoke of hard work and a face that was all sharp angles and shadows under the brim of a stained hat. He was not handsome in the way of city men, but his presence was solid, like a deep-rooted tree. He knelt opposite Mara, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, taking in the scene without a flicker of panic. He looked at the boy, then at Mara's hands, firm and capable on his son's, or perhaps his charge's arm. "He is one of yours?" Mara asked, not looking up from her work. The man gave a single, curt nod. "The metal needs to come out," she said plainly. "It has to be done now. Before the wound closes around it, it will hurt." He just watched her for a moment, his gaze assessing. "Can you do it?" His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel. "I can." He nodded again, then looked down at the boy, whose eyes were now open, wide with fear and pain. "Eli," the man said, his voice softening just a fraction, "you listen to the lady. It will be a short hurt." Eli's lower lip trembled, but he nodded. The man placed a large, calloused hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture of silent, unyielding support. Mara took a deep breath. With one swift, practiced movement, she pulled the shard of metal free. Eli cried out, a sharp, ragged sound, and arched his back. But the man held him steady. Blood welled up, and Mara immediately pressed the clean, wet cloth to the wound. "It is done," she said softly to the boy. "The worst is over." She cleaned the wound as best she could, her movements efficient and gentle. She washed the burn on his forearm and applied a makeshift bandage, tearing more strips from her petticoat. Through it all, the tall man remained silent, his stormy eyes missing nothing. When she was finished, he scooped the boy effortlessly into his arms. Eli, pale and trembling, buried his face in the man's shoulder. The man stood, looking down at Mara, who was still kneeling in the dust, her hands and dress stained with the boy's blood. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said. The words were simple, dry as the dust on his boots, but there was a current of genuine gratitude beneath them. He turned and walked away, his long strides eating up the ground, leaving Mara alone in the now quiet circle of onlookers. Later, inside Olson's mercantile, the air thick with the smell of coffee, leather, and dried apples, the whispers started. May Olson, the proprietor, a stout woman with kind eyes and an expression of perpetual competence, gave Mara a cup of water and a place to sit. "That was Colt Ransom," May said, her voice low, "and the boy was Eli. One of his son," Mara asked, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. May gave a short, non-committal laugh. "Some say yes, some say no. He has got a whole herd of them up at his ranch. 5, I think, boys and girls. No wife, though. Never has had one. Far as anyone knows. Just him, a couple of young ranch hands, and that pack of children he has collected." The story unfolded in snippets and conjecture from the men who had drifted in from the saloon. Ransom was a quiet man, kept to himself. The ranch was his inheritance. But the children were not. They were strays, orphans, and runaways he had taken in over the years. A baby left on the church steps. A boy whose parents had perished in a blizzard. A girl who had simply wandered into his barn one day and refused to leave. He just kept them. As they spoke, another man entered the store. He wore a deputy's star on his vest, but it seemed too shiny, too new. He was handsome, with a smooth face and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He moved with a politician's practiced ease. "Deputy Silas Crowley," he said, tipping his hat to Mara. "I heard you were the angel of mercy today. The whole town is grateful." He paused, his eyes lingering on her. "I also heard the boy was from the ransom place." Mara nodded. "He will be fine. The wound was clean." "Good, good," Crowley said, though his tone suggested it was merely a formality. "Still, it is a shame. A boy that age ought to be in a proper home, with proper supervision. Not on some rough-and-tumble ranch run by a man with unconventional arrangements." He let the words hang in the air. "The railroad is coming through, you know. They need land for a depot. Good, flat land with water access. Land just like Ransom's." He smiled again. A man with so many mouths to feed and no legal papers for any of them. Well, he might find himself in a precarious position when the law starts taking a closer look. A very precarious position indeed. He tipped his hat once more and left, leaving a chill in the warm, cluttered store. The implications were clear. The land was wanted, and the children were the lever to get it. That evening, as Mara sat in the small, clean room she had rented above the mercantile, May Olson knocked on her door. "I was just up at the ransom place, delivering some supplies," the older woman said, twisting a corner of her apron. "Colt Ransom. He asked me to talk to you. He saw what you did for Eli. He said he has never seen hands that steady. He needs a teacher for those children, someone to patch up their scrapes. Too, it would just be for the season, until the cattle drive. He cannot pay much, but you would have a room and meals." Mara looked out her window at the darkening landscape. A section of fence along the main road was broken, the posts leaning at a sad, tired angle. The job was the opposite of what she had wanted. It was not quiet or invisible. It was a house full of children, a constant, living reminder of the one thing her body had failed to do. It was a nest of complications, with men like Crowley circling overhead. But she also saw the image of the boy, his face pale with fear, and the tall, silent man holding him, a bastion against the pain. She saw a place full of broken things, a splintered family that needed mending, and for the first time in a long time, she felt not the ache of her own emptiness, but the pull of a purpose. Perhaps, she thought, the only way to patch a life together is to start by mending someone else's. "Tell him I will do it," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than it had been in months. "I will start in the morning." The ride to Ransom Ranch was a silent one. Colt Ransom handled the wagon with an economy of motion, his hands firm on the reins, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the jagged peaks of the mountains clawed at the pale blue sky. Mara sat beside him, her satchel at her feet, feeling the vast, empty beauty of the land settle into her bones. It was a place that did not care for a person's sorrows. It simply was, and you either found a way to endure it or you were broken by it. The ranch itself appeared suddenly, a collection of sturdy, unadorned buildings nestled in a shallow valley, protected from the worst of the wind. A long, low ranch house with a wide porch stood at the center, smoke curling from its stone chimney. There was a large barn, a series of corrals, and a small bunkhouse for the hands. It was a place built for work, not for show. As they drew closer, the silence was broken by the sound of running feet and high, excited voices. 4 children spilled from the front door of the house and ran toward the wagon, a whirlwind of limbs and energy. A girl of about 12, with a sharp, intelligent face and braids that bounced as she ran, was in the lead. Close behind was a scruffy boy a few years younger, his hair a wild tangle and a grin plastered on his face. A much smaller girl, no older than 5, with wide, dreamy eyes, toddled after them. Eli, his arm now neatly bandaged, followed at a more reserved pace, his quiet eyes finding Mara's with a flicker of recognition. The boy with the wild hair, who Mara would learn was named Huck, immediately tried to climb the wagon wheel. The older girl, Nora, grabbed the back of his shirt and said, "Your boots are covered in mud." "You little heathen." Huck stuck his tongue out at her. The little girl, Rosie, reached the wagon and simply stood there, staring up at Mara with a solemn intensity. Colt swung down from the wagon and lifted Rosie into his arms with a practiced ease. She immediately wrapped her small arms around his neck and hid her face in his shoulder. He looked at the other children, his expression unreadable. "This is Miss Quinn," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "She is here to be your teacher, and to see that you do not break any more bones than necessary." Nora looked Mara up and down with a critical eye. She asked, "Do you know long division?" Before Mara could answer, Huck piped up, "Can you teach me how to spit farther than Nate?" Nate was apparently one of the 2 young ranch hands who emerged from the barn, watching the proceedings with amused expressions. Mara smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She said, "I can teach you division, and I suppose I can offer some advice on trajectory. But I make no promises." The inside of the ranch house was clean and warm, a stark contrast to the harsh world outside. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace and a long wooden table scarred with the marks of countless meals. A stew bubbled on the stove, filling the air with the savory scent of beef and onions. It was a man's home, functional and sparse, but there were touches of a softer hand. A stack of worn books on a shelf, a row of colorful wildflowers wilting in a jar on the windowsill, and hanging from a peg near the hearth, a half-finished shawl of soft blue wool, the needle still resting in the stitches. It looked as if someone had set it down mid-row, intending to come right back, and had simply never returned. Mara felt an involuntary pull toward it. She reached out and touched the wool, its softness a ghost of a feeling she had tried hard to forget. She quickly pulled her hand away. Life at Ransom Ranch fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. Mornings were for chores, the air filled with the sounds of milking, the chopping of wood, and the lowing of cattle. Afternoons were for lessons. Mara set up their school on the wide and covered porch, using a spare plank set over 2 barrels as a desk. She taught with what she had. Letters were formed with dried beans. Sums were calculated with smooth river stones. The children were a study in contrasts. Nora was a thirsty sponge, soaking up every fact and figure. Eli was thoughtful and artistic, his letters always perfectly formed, his attention wandering only when he stopped to sketch a horse in the dust with a stick. Huck was a restless bundle of energy, more interested in the workings of a grasshopper's leg than in his multiplication tables. And little Rosie would sit quietly, her attention flitting like a butterfly, often humming a tune only she could hear. Mara watched Colt Ransom as he went about his day. He was a man of profound silence, but she was beginning to learn his language. It was in the way he would stop to check the cinch on a young hand's saddle, his hands moving with a quiet expertise. It was in the way he noticed a fresh scrape on Huck's knee before the boy even started to complain, steering him toward Mara for a bandage without a word. She saw him one afternoon, after a long day of branding, carefully mending a frayed rein by the light of a lantern. His large, rough hands surprisingly deft. He was a man who mended things, fences, harnesses, children. It was a quiet, unassuming form of love, a masculinity so gentle it was almost invisible. One afternoon, Mara was explaining a passage from a book she had been reading aloud to them, something about ancient Greek thinkers. Huck, bored, asked, "What is philosophy?" Before Mara could answer, Colt, who had been passing by on his way to the barn, paused. He cleared his throat and said, "It is about asking why things are the way they are." Nora, ever the sharp one, seized her chance. She said, "Mr. Ransom, can you say it, that big word?" A slow flush crept up Colt's neck. He mumbled, "Philos phi." Huck hooted with laughter. "That is not how she said it." Colt shot the boy a look that was meant to be stern, but Mara could see the corner of his mouth twitching. He said, "Get back to your letters, all of you, or there will be no stew for supper." He turned and walked away, and as he did, Mara saw him break into a slow, private smile. The gentle rhythm of their days was a balm to Mara's soul, but her own fears were never far beneath the surface. One night, she awoke to a strange silence. The wind had died down, and the house was unnervingly still. A sliver of moonlight cut across the wooden floor of her small room. She sat up, listening. A floorboard creaked in the main room. A feeling of cold dread washed over her, an old and terrible companion. She slipped out of bed and crept to the door. Rosie's small cot in the corner of the main room was empty. Panic, swift and suffocating, seized Mara. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and the memory of another small, still form in another quiet room threatened to overwhelm her. She forced it down, her training battling against her grief. She had lost one child. She would not lose another. She hurried through the house, her bare feet silent on the cool planks. She found the front door slightly ajar. Outside, the world was bathed in a ghostly silver light, and there, standing at the edge of the porch, was Rosie. She was fast asleep, her small face peaceful in the moonlight, her arms outstretched as if she were trying to embrace the night sky. Mara's breath came out in a ragged, shaky sigh of relief. She went to the little girl and gently took her hand. Rosie did not wake, but she allowed herself to be led back inside, her small hand warm and trusting in Mara's. As Mara tucked her back into her cot, she was trembling. The fear had been so real, so absolute. She had built a wall around her heart to keep from feeling that kind of loss again. But these children, with their scraped knees and tangled hair, were chipping away at it, stone by stone. The following week, Deputy Silas Crowley paid them a visit. He rode up on a fine black horse, his saddle gleaming, a stark contrast to the hard-working leather of the ranch. He said he was just in the area, checking on the welfare of the territory's citizens. Colt met him on the porch, his stance wide and unyielding, a silent rock against which Crowley's smooth words washed. "A fine operation you have here." "Ransom," Crowley said, his eyes sweeping over the property, but not in admiration. He was taking inventory, but it is a lot of work for one man. And all these children, he gestured vaguely toward the porch where Nora and Eli were reading. They require a proper home. Procedures must be followed. The territory has standards now. It is all about bloodlines. You see, proper legal guardianship. His gaze lingered on the barn, then on the creek that wound its way through the pasture. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and made a few notes. He was not just a deputy. He was a surveyor, a planner, an agent of a future that had no room for a place like this. His presence was a violation, a cold draft of the outside world blowing through their warm, fragile peace. Colt said nothing. He simply stood there, his silence more powerful than any argument. After a few more minutes of pointed pleasantries, Crowley tipped his hat and rode away. That evening, the mood in the house was subdued. The children felt the tension, though they did not understand its source after the younger ones were asleep. Mara sat at the long table, mending a tear in Huck's shirt. Colt sat across from her, cleaning a rifle, the metallic click and slide of the mechanism the only sound in the room. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "He is not wrong. There are no papers." Mara looked up. She said, "This is a proper home." He looked at her, his stormy eyes filled with a deep, weary frustration. He said, "The law does not care about what feels right. It cares about what is written down." Mara did not know what to say. She looked at the small, sturdy stitches she was making in the boy's shirt, pulling the torn fabric back together. She thought of the half-finished shawl hanging by the hearth, a symbol of a family interrupted. This family, this strange and beautiful herd of strays, was just as precarious. It was a home built on nothing more than a man's quiet sense of duty, and it could all be torn apart by a man with a notebook and a talk of bloodlines. The next afternoon, as the lessons were winding down, Mara found Huck sitting by himself in the yard, a look of intense concentration on his face. He was using a stick to scratch something in the fine red dust. She walked over and looked down. He had been practicing his letters, over and over. He had drawn the first letter of his new hero's name. It was a bit wobbly, the circle not quite closed, the leg a little crooked, but it was unmistakable. He had drawn a perfect, dusty R, for ransom. He looked up at her, his face beaming with pride, in the face of all the uncertainty, in defiance of all the cold threats of the world. A boy had learned to write his name. It was a small thing, but in that moment, it felt like the most important victory in the world. The calm was a fragile thing, easily broken. It shattered on a bright, cloudless afternoon with the sharp crack of aging wood and a cry of surprise from Nora. She had been perched atop a corral fence, demonstrating to a skeptical Huck how a cat could maintain its balance on the narrowest of beams. The top rail, weathered by years of sun and snow, gave way without warning. She fell in a tangle of limbs, landing hard in the dusty enclosure. Mara was on the porch, reviewing Eli's careful drawings, when she heard the sound. It was not the fall that sent a spike of ice through her veins, but the silence that followed it. She was running before she was even fully aware of making the decision. Colt, who had been inspecting a horse's hoof near the barn, was moving just as fast, their paths converging on the small, crumpled figure on the ground. Nora was trying to be brave, her face pale and streaked with dirt, her teeth clamped firmly on her lower lip to keep from crying. Her ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle. Mara knelt beside her, her own heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She forced a breath, pushing down the surge of panic. "Calm," she told herself. "You are needed. Be calm." She gently probed the girl's leg, her fingers light and sure. Nora flinched, a sharp hiss of pain escaping her lips. Mara said, "I know it hurts. Sweetheart, just a moment longer." Colt stood over them, a tall, silent shadow. He watched Mara's hands as she worked. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her fingers, the telltale sign of a fear held tightly in check. But he also saw the absolute certainty in her movements, the practiced efficiency that spoke of knowledge and control. Her hands were afraid, but they were not weak. They were steady. She said, "It needs to be set and splinted. We cannot move her until it is—" "Colt, I need 2 flat pieces of board, about this long, and tear some strips from that clean flour sack in the kitchen." He did not question her. He was gone and back in moments, the requested items in hand. Mara took the boards and cloth, her mind a quiet, focused space where all that existed was the task before her. She looked at Nora, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of pain and fear. She said, "This is the hard part. Nora, I need you to be the bravest you have ever been for just a few seconds. Colt, I need you to hold her steady." He knelt, his large hands gently but firmly gripping Nora's shoulders. Mara took the girl's small foot in her hands, closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, and then, with a swift, clean motion, pulled and twisted. There was a faint but sickening pop. Nora screamed, a raw, piercing sound that tore at Mara's heart. But she did not let go until she was sure the bone was aligned. Then, working quickly, she patted the ankle with cloth and secured the wooden splints, her knots tight and even. By the time she was finished, Nora's screams had subsided into quiet, exhausted sobs. Colt lifted her as if she weighed nothing and carried her into the house. Mara followed, her legs feeling strangely weak, the adrenaline draining away to leave a profound weariness behind. They had just settled Nora onto a cot in the main room, her leg propped on a pillow, when the sound of an approaching horse drew their attention. It was Deputy Silas Crowley. He dismounted with his customary fluid grace and strode onto the porch, a folded document in his hand. He said, "Ransom, I have official business." His eyes flickered to Nora on the cot, a look of mild, insincere concern on his face. Another accident. This place seems to be a magnet for them. Colt moved to block the doorway, his body a silent command for the deputy to go no further. He asked, "What do you want?" "Crowley." The deputy smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. He held up the paper. He said, "This is a formal notice from the Territorial Circuit Judge in Cheyenne. It seems some concerned citizens have raised questions about the welfare of the children residing on this property." He unfolded the document with a theatrical flourish. "You have 15 days to produce legally binding articles of guardianship for each and every child. Furthermore, a territorial inspector will be arriving on the 16th day to conduct a thorough review of the living conditions. Should you fail on either count, the children will be remanded to the custody of the state and transferred to the Cheyenne Orphan House for proper placement." The words fell into the quiet room like stones into a still pond. Cheyenne Orphan House. It was a place spoken of in whispers, a grim institution where children were lost to a system of bureaucracy and neglect. Mara felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Nora, pale and sleeping, at Eli, who had come to stand silently in the corner, his eyes wide, at Huck and Rosie, who were peering from behind the kitchen door, sensing the cold dread that had entered their home. Colt took the paper from Crowley's hand. His own hand was perfectly steady. He read it, his expression hardening into granite. He said, "On what grounds?" Crowley shrugged, a picture of false sympathy. "The law is the law. Ransom. The territory is becoming civilized. We have standards. The law prioritizes blood kinship. Hearsay from neighbors and a preacher is not a legal document." "Of course," he added, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "There are always other solutions to financial and legal pressures. The Northern and Plains Railroad is prepared to make you a very generous offer for that strip of land along the creek." A man with a bit of cash in his pocket? A man showing he can provide? It might look better to the inspector. The creek was the ranch's artery. It watered the herds, nourished the small vegetable garden, and provided for the house. To sell it would be to sell the future of the ranch itself. The offer was not a solution. It was a threat. Colt folded the paper with slow, deliberate precision. He said, "Get off my land." Crowley's smile tightened. He said, 15 days. Ransom. The clock is ticking." He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a cloud of red dust and a profound silence in his wake. That night, the house was suffocating with a tension the children were too young to understand, but too sensitive not to feel. After they were asleep, Mara found Colt on the porch, staring out into the darkness. She said, "We can fight this." He did not look at her. He said, "With what I am not their father, I have no papers, no rights." She said, "You have their lives. You have the home you have given them. That has to count for something." She took a breath, her mind racing, organizing. "We will get testimony. Written, signed testimony. May Olson will sign. Father Abel will sign. The doctor from town. He can attest to their health. We will make a record of everything. The lessons, the meals, their growth. We will show them this is not just a place to live. We will show them it is a family." For the first time, he turned to look at her. In the faint moonlight, she could see the deep lines of worry etched around his eyes. He said nothing, but he gave a single, slow nod. It was all the permission she needed. The next few days were a blur of determined activity. Mara rode into Copper Creek and spoke with a fierce, quiet passion to anyone who would listen. May Olson, her face set in a grim line of indignation, immediately signed a statement detailing Colt's character and the steady stream of supplies he bought for the children. Never for himself. Father Abel, the circuit preacher who passed through town every few weeks, wrote a long, eloquent letter about the nature of a chosen family. A family bound by love and duty, not just by an accident of birth. He called Colt's ranch a work of true Christian charity. Mara even tracked down Dr. Miller, who, after a thorough examination of Nora's splinted ankle, and a review of the care Eli had received. Wrote a medical affidavit confirming the children were well cared for and in good health. Mara spent her evenings at the long kitchen table, the oil lamp casting a warm circle of light, meticulously documenting every aspect of their lives. She created charts to track the children's height and weight. She saved Eli's drawings and Nora's perfect sums. She made a note of every small triumph, every milestone. She was building a fortress of paper, a defense made of the simple, undeniable facts of their lives. One evening, she came into the main room to find Colt sitting by the fire, a small, torn shirt in his hands. It was Huck's. He was trying to mend a rip near the shoulder, but his large, calloused fingers were clumsy with the tiny needle and thread. He was frowning in concentration, his tongue caught between his teeth, looking more frustrated by the small piece of fabric than he had by Crowley's official notice. A smile touched Mara's lips. She pulled up a stool and sat beside him. She said softly, "Here, let me show you." He looked up, a hint of embarrassment in his stormy eyes, and handed her the shirt. She did not take it. Instead, she guided his hands, showing him how to make the stitches small and even. Her fingers brushed against his, and a jolt of warmth, quiet and unexpected, passed between them. It was a simple, domestic moment, a pocket of peace in the middle of a storm. He was clumsy, and she was patient. A low laugh escaped him, a rough, unused sound. She found herself laughing with him, the shared sound a startlingly intimate thing in the quiet room. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it transformed his hard, weathered face, revealing a kindness he kept carefully guarded. The brief moment of peace was shattered 2 days later. Colt had ridden into town for supplies, and Crowley found him outside the mercantile. Mara was not there to hear it, but Colt's face when he returned to the ranch told the entire story. It was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He told her what the deputy had said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Crowley had made it clear that the affidavits and the town's support meant nothing. He had smirked and told Colt that a railroad did not run on goodwill. It ran on water, and the Northern and Plains Railroad was going to get its water. He stood by the corral fence, staring at the creek as it glittered in the afternoon sun. "A silver ribbon of life," he said. His last words to me were a promise. He looked at Mara, his eyes as bleak and unforgiving as a winter sky. "The water station needs to stand here," he quoted, his voice a low growl, "or your family will be washed away somewhere else." The weight of Crowley's threat settled over the ranch like a low, suffocating fog. The days were shorter now, the wind carrying the first real bite of autumn, and it seemed to steal the warmth from inside the house as well. There was an unspoken tension that coiled in the air, a clock ticking down in all their minds. The children, sensitive as wild animals to a change in the weather, grew quiet and watchful, their laughter less frequent. One evening, the wind rose to a mournful howl, rattling the window panes and finding its way through every crack in the old house. It was a lonely, unsettling sound. Inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. Little Rosie, who had been listless all day, developed a fever. It was not a dangerous one, but her skin was hot and dry to the touch, and she tossed restlessly in her cot, caught in the grip of a fretful dream. Mara sat beside her, bathing her small forehead with a cloth dipped in cool water. The rest of the children were asleep, tucked into their beds and makeshift pallets. The main room was lit only by the soft glow of the fire and a single oil lamp on the table, its flame dancing and wavering with every gust of wind that breached the walls. The flickering light cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. She was so absorbed in her task, in the rhythmic dip and press of the cloth, that she did not hear Colt enter from the porch. He moved with a silence that was unnerving in a man his size. He placed a few more logs on the fire, the soft thud of the wood the only announcement of his presence. He did not speak, but instead took a seat at the long table, a silent sentinel in the flickering darkness. He began checking the action on a worn rifle. The metallic clicks and slides, a small, oddly comforting sound against the wail of the wind. He was simply there, sharing the vigil. Hours passed in this quiet companionship. The fire crackled, the wind moaned. Rosie murmured in her sleep. Mara felt the walls she had so carefully constructed around her heart begin to dissolve in the shared silence. Here, in this small circle of lamplight, with a sick child breathing softly nearby and a quiet man standing guard. The world shrank to the size of this room. All the noise of her past, the pitying looks, the hollow ache of her own empty arms, seemed to fade, replaced by the simple, immediate need of the small girl in the cot. She looked at Rosie's face, so perfect and peaceful in sleep. Her tiny lips parted, her eyelashes dark against her flushed cheek. A wave of such fierce, protective tenderness washed over Mara that it stole her breath. It was a feeling she had sworn she would never allow herself to feel again. It was dangerous. It was the feeling of a heart breaking, not from sorrow, but from a love so profound it was a physical pain. The secret she carried, the one that defined her, the one that had driven her from her home and into this wild, empty land, rose in her throat like a fever of its own. It was a truth she had never spoken aloud to anyone, a brand of failure she bore in silence. But here, in the fragile intimacy of the night, the silence became too heavy a burden to carry alone. Looking at Rosie, not at Colt, she let the words slip out into the dim, warm air. They were barely a sound, a whisper of breath meant for herself as much as for him. "I can't have kids," she whispered. The words hung in the space between them, stark and vulnerable. The clicking of the rifle stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind and the fire. She did not dare to look at him. She expected pity, or perhaps an awkward, clumsy attempt at comfort. She expected the conversation to end, the fragile connection between them to be severed by the terrible, unfixable truth of her body. She braced herself for the familiar sting of shame. Instead, after a long moment, she heard a soft sound. She risked a glance. Colt was looking at her, his face half in shadow. The expression in his stormy eyes was not one of pity. It was something else entirely, something steady and quiet and accepting. And then, a slow smile touched his lips. It was a small thing, just a gentle lifting at the corners of his mouth, but it was like the sun breaking through a week of clouds. "Good thing I've already got a herd," he said. His voice was a low, quiet rumble, as steady as the earth beneath the house. The words struck Mara with the force of a physical blow, but it was a blow that did not wound. It healed. It was not a dismissal of her pain, but a reframing of her reality. He had taken her brokenness and, with a few simple, honest words, had declared it irrelevant. He did not see her as a barren woman, an object of pity. He saw her as a person, and in his world, a world built on action and necessity. The family he had was the only one that mattered. The ache in her chest, the one she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it was like to be without it, began to ease. It was as if a great, heavy anchor she had been dragging behind her for years had just been cut loose. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a hot path down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but not before he saw it. He said nothing, merely held her gaze, his own eyes communicating a depth of understanding that words never could. The profound, fragile moment was suddenly broken by a sleepy voice from the shadows under the table. "How many is in a herd?" Huck emerged from beneath the long table, rubbing his eyes. He had been asleep on a pile of blankets, hidden from view. He looked from Colt to Mara, his expression one of pure, childish curiosity. The spell was broken, but the magic lingered. The heavy, emotional air in the room was suddenly lighter, clearer. Colt's smile widened into a genuine, if fleeting, grin. He looked at the boy, then back at Mara, a warm, teasing light in his eyes. "Enough to make a teacher nervous," he said. A real, unburdened laugh escaped Mara's lips. The sound was as startling to her as it was to him. It felt like a rediscovery, a forgotten language. As if on cue, Rosie stirred in her cot, kicking at the blanket that had been carefully tucked around her. At the exact same moment, both Mara and Colt reached to pull it back up. Their hands met over the small girl's body. His hand was large, the skin rough and calloused from a lifetime of hard labor. Hers was smaller, softer, but no less capable. The contact was brief, accidental, but a current of warmth, as real and potent as a lightning strike on a distant hill, passed between them. It was a small, quiet shock that left an echo of heat on her skin long after they had both pulled away. Mara looked at the oil lamp on the table. Outside, the wind still howled its lonely song, a reminder of the storm that was gathering, of the threat that circled their home. But inside, the flame no longer danced and flickered. It burned with a clear, steady light, pushing the shadows back into the corners of the room. A quiet, unspoken resolve settled between them. They had not spoken of Crowley, or the law, or the 15 days that were slipping away, one by one. But they did not need to. In the shared vigil, in the quiet confession and the gentle acceptance, a new alliance had been forged. They would face the coming storm, together. The quiet resolve forged in the fire-lit room became Mara's guiding principle. The dawn after Rosie's fever broke. She rose not with dread, but with a fierce, clear-headed purpose. While Colt and the hands saw to the ranch, Mara laid claim to the long kitchen table, transforming it from a place of meals into a command center. She was no longer just a teacher. She was an archivist, a defender building a bulwark of paper and ink against the coming tide. She started a new ledger, its pages clean and stark. This was not a book of finances, but of a family's life, with meticulous care. She documented everything. She recorded each meal, noting the fresh milk, the vegetables from their small garden, the way Huck always tried to trade his beans for Eli's portion of bread. She logged every lesson, pasting in Nora's neatly solved arithmetic problems and describing how Huck had finally mastered the spelling of his own name. She charted their hygiene, the weekly baths, the mended clothes, the clean straw ticking in their mattresses. It was a litany of the mundane, a testament to the quiet, constant rhythm of care that defined their days. Eli, with his artist's eye, became her collaborator. She gave him a stack of clean paper and a piece of charcoal, and he set about creating a family portrait, not in a single stiff pose, but in a series of sketches. He drew Nora reading on the porch, her brow furrowed in concentration. He drew Huck chasing a chicken, a blur of motion and joyous energy. He drew Rosie sleeping with a corn-husk doll clutched in her hand. He drew Colt mending a fence, his shoulders a strong, solid line against the vast sky. Mara carefully collected each drawing, adding them to the growing dossier. This was their life, not in the cold language of law, but in the undeniable warmth of charcoal on paper. The community, sparked by Mara's determination, began to move. May Olson, her face a mask of righteous indignation, hung a sign in the window of her mercantile announcing a church box lunch social to be held on Sunday. The townswomen, many of whom had little to spare, brought what they could: fried chicken, potato salad, freshly baked pies. They were not just raising money, they were casting a vote. Each dollar dropped into the collection jar was a declaration that the family at Ransom Ranch was a part of their community, a part they would not let be swept away by the ambitions of a railroad and a corrupt deputy. Father Abel, his gentle face hardened with resolve, rode his circuit, collecting signatures on a petition that declared Colt Ransom a fit and proper guardian in the eyes of God and his neighbors. With this growing stack of evidence, her meticulous ledger, Eli's drawings, and the community's signed support, Mara rode into Copper Creek to face Silas Crowley. She found him at the county clerk's office, a small, dusty room that smelled of aging paper and stale cigar smoke. He was leaning against the counter, exuding an air of bored authority. He smiled when he saw her. He said, "Miss Quinn, to what do I owe the pleasure come to surrender?" Mara met his gaze without flinching. She placed the official notice he had delivered on the counter between them. She said, "I have come to point out an error in this document. Deputy..." Crowley's smile faltered. He picked up the paper, his eyes scanning it with a hint of irritation. He said, "I assure you, it is all perfectly legal." She said, "The date on which this notice was officially filed with the circuit clerk is listed as October 12th. However, you delivered it to the ranch on October 10th. According to territorial statute, a notice of this kind is not valid until one full business day after its filing. Therefore, your 15-day clock did not start on the 10th. It started on the 13th. You have miscalculated." He stared at the paper, his face flushing a dull red. It was a minor point, a matter of 2 days, but it was an error born of his own arrogance and haste. Mara pressed her small advantage. She said, "It is a rather small print. Deputy, perhaps you are having trouble seeing it. May I?" She reached over, and with a polite but firm motion, she plucked the spectacles from his vest pocket, opened them, and held them up for him. She pointed a finger at the date. Right there. For a moment, he was speechless, caught off guard by her audacity. He snatched the spectacles from her hand, his composure cracking. He was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by a woman. He refolded the paper with a sharp, angry snap. He said, "A clerical error. It changes nothing. The inspection will proceed." She met his angry gaze with a look of cool composure. She said, "It changes the date of that inspection, and it shows a certain lack of attention to detail that a judge might find interesting." She turned and walked out, leaving him sputtering in the dusty silence. Crowley's retaliation was swift and cruel. 3 nights later, a cold, driving rain swept across the plains, turning the ranch yard into a sea of mud. The storm provided the perfect cover. In the morning, when one of the young hands went out to check the herd, he returned with a grim face. A dozen of their best new calves were gone. The fence had been cut, and the tracks in the mud, though blurred by the rain, told a clear story. Rustlers. It was a devastating blow. The calves represented the ranch's profit for the entire season, the money needed for winter supplies and seed for the spring. Now, it was gone. Colt's face was a thundercloud. This was an attack he understood, a language of violence and theft he could answer. He gathered the 2 young hands, Nate and Billy, and set out at once, his jaws set in a hard, unforgiving line. He followed the faint trail for hours, his tracking skills honed by a lifetime on the plains. By midday, he found them. 3 men, huddled around a small fire in a hidden ravine, the stolen calves tied nearby. The fight was short and brutal. Colt moved with a contained, efficient fury. He and his hands were outnumbered, but they were driven by a righteous anger. They captured one of the rustlers, a scrawny man with shifty eyes. The other 2 scrambled onto their horses and fled into the rough country. They marched their prisoner back to Copper Creek and delivered him directly to the deputy's office. Colt stood before Crowley's desk, his clothes muddy and torn, his knuckles bruised, and laid out the facts. He said, "We caught him with my calves. The brand is clear. The tracks lead from my fence to his camp." Crowley listened with a look of detached boredom. He looked the rustler up and down. He said, "Is this true? Did you steal this man's cattle?" The rustler, seeing his chance, shook his head frantically. He said, "No, sir, I bought them calves, fair and square, from a fella I met on the trail. I got no bill of sale, but it was an honest deal." Crowley turned back to Colt. He said, "There you have it. It is his word against yours. You have no witness besides your own employees, and no bill of sale to prove your ownership in the first place. I have no evidence of a crime." He gestured to the door. "I am releasing this man for lack of proof." Colt stared at him, disbelief warring with a cold, rising fury. He had delivered the criminal, the proof plain as day, and the law had simply shrugged and looked the other way. He took a step toward the desk, his hands clenching into fists, but Crowley just smiled his thin, smug smile. Colt turned without another word and strode out of the office. The ride back to the ranch was the longest of his life. He had failed. He had tried to meet the threat head-on, to fight back in the only way he knew how, and it had been useless. That evening, Mara found him in the barn, his back to her, running a brush over a horse's flank with hard, angry strokes. He said, his voice low and ragged, "I cannot do it. I cannot keep them safe. I bring them here. I give them a roof, and I cannot even protect what is theirs. I am not good enough for them." Mara came to stand beside him. She did not touch him. She just stood there, her presence a quiet, unwavering support. She said, "You did what you could. The law is not always just Colt. Sometimes it is just a tool for men like Crowley. Justice is not a fist fight. Sometimes it is a long, slow wait. It requires patience." He finally stopped brushing the horse and turned to face her. The anguish in his eyes was so profound it made her own heart ache. She said, "We have the truth on our side. We have to believe that it will be enough." Later that night, long after the house had fallen silent, Mara went to the hearth. She took down the half-finished blue shawl. The wool was soft and cool in her hands. She found the last stitch on the needle, her fingers moving with a forgotten familiarity. She sat in the rocking chair by the dying embers of the fire and, with a soft click of the needles, she began to knit. She was adding a new row, weaving a new thread of hope into the fabric of their lives. She had been knitting for less than an hour when a rider approached the house, his horse's hooves muffled by the soft earth. It was Billy, one of the young hands, sent back from town. He carried another official paper. It was a notice, signed by Deputy Crowley, the territorial inspector. It seemed, had adjusted his schedule. The formal inspection of Ransom Ranch would take place in 72 hours. The 72 hours stretched before them like a barren, windswept plain. The notice from Crowley had poisoned the air, turning every tick of the clock into a countdown toward disaster. They threw themselves into work, a frantic, desperate effort to scrub, mend, and organize the ranch into an undeniable picture of a perfect home. Mara drilled the children on their letters and numbers until their heads swam, while Colt and the hands repaired every loose board and sagging fence post, their hammers echoing the frantic beat of Mara's heart. But the world paid no mind to their deadline. On the second day, nature unleashed a fury that made their human worries seem small and insignificant. The sky, a placid blue in the morning, turned a bruised greenish-black by midday. The air grew heavy and still, the silence before a violent explosion. Then came the hail. It started as small, stinging pellets, but quickly grew to the size of marbles, then acorns, hammering against the roof in a deafening, relentless assault. The children, wide-eyed with a mixture of terror and awe, huddled away from the windows as the world outside was battered and broken. The hailstorm was followed by a torrential, sheeting rain. The dry, thirsty earth could not absorb the deluge. The small, placid creek that was the ranch's lifeblood transformed into a raging, muddy torrent. It tore at its banks, swallowing bushes and small trees, its roar a constant, menacing growl that filled the house. And inside, a far more intimate and terrifying crisis was unfolding. Rosie, who had been pale and quiet since the storm began, started to shiver uncontrollably. Mara touched her forehead and felt a terrifying, familiar heat. The fever was back, and it was climbing with an alarming speed. Within an hour, the little girl was lost to them, her small body burning, her lips cracked and dry. She began to murmur, her eyes wide and unseeing, her small hands plucking at the blankets as she spoke to people who were not there. She was delirious. Mara's blood ran cold. She flew to the small medicine box, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the latch. She knew what she needed, the tincture of willow bark and feverfew that had worked before. Her fingers closed around the small brown bottle. It was empty. A wave of nausea and pure, unadulterated fear washed over her. She had used the last of it on Rosie's previous fever, and in the chaos of the past few days, she had forgotten to ask Colt to get more from town. She looked out the window at the churning, brown water. The wooden bridge that spanned the creek, their only way to town, was already half submerged, the water surging over its planks, causing the entire structure to shudder and groan. Town and Dr. Miller might as well have been on the other side of the ocean. Colt came to stand beside her, his face grim as he took in the scene. He had seen the empty bottle in her hand, had seen the stark terror in her eyes. He needed no explanation. He said, his voice quiet but absolute, "I will ride." Mara turned to him, her own fear momentarily eclipsed by disbelief. She said, "You cannot. Look at that water. It is dark. The bridge could go at any moment. You will be swept away." He walked to the hearth and pulled his heavy oilskin coat from its peg. He said, "The doctor is the only chance she has. I will bring him back." She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. She said, "Colt, no, it is a fool's errand. It is suicide. Wait until morning. The rain might stop. The water might go down." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then met her eyes. His gaze was steady, resolute, and filled with a pain that mirrored her own. Then he looked over at the small, tossing form in the cot. He said, "She does not have until morning." He gently removed her hand from his arm. His voice was not harsh, but it held a finality that allowed for no argument. He said, "I will take the hard part. You stay here. Keep her fighting." He turned and was gone, the heavy door swinging shut behind him, leaving Mara in a silence that was more terrifying than the roar of the storm. For a long moment, she was paralyzed, the enormity of the situation threatening to crush her. 2 lives were now balanced on a razor's edge, a little girl burning with fever, and a stubborn, brave man riding into the teeth of a flood. Then, from the cot, Rosie cried out, a thin, nonsensical wail. The sound broke through Mara's fear and solidified it into a cold, hard resolve. Colt had his part to play, and she had hers. She turned to the other children, who were huddled together near the fire, their faces pale with a fear they did not fully understand. She gathered them close. She said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the swirling chaos, "We all have a job to do. Huck, you are in charge of the fire. It cannot go out. Not for a minute. Can you do that?" Huck, his usual mischief replaced by a solemn sense of purpose, nodded, his small chin set with determination. She said, "Eli, I need you to keep a supply of cool cloths ready, just like I showed you before. You have the gentlest hands. Rosie needs that." Eli's quiet eyes met hers, and he gave a single, firm nod before moving to the water basin. She looked at Nora. She said, "Nora, you are the reader. Find the Book of Psalms. I want you to read to her. Your voice will be a comfort. Read loud enough for her to hear you over the storm." Nora, her face tight with worry, retrieved the heavy Bible and sat on a stool by the cot, her young voice beginning the ancient words of comfort and hope. Mara herself returned to Rosie's side. She began to tell a story, a long, rambling tale of a brave princess and a magical horse, her voice a low, steady murmur, a constant presence against the fever's ravages. The house became a fortress, not of wood and stone, but of purpose. Each child had their station. Huck fed the fire, Eli changed the cloths, Nora read the holy words, and Mara spun a web of stories, all of them working together. A small, determined family holding the darkness at bay. Outside, Colt was fighting a different kind of battle. The world was a churning, roaring chaos of darkness and water. His horse, a steady, powerful buckskin, fought for its footing in the slick, deep mud, rain, driven by the wind. Felt like needles against his skin. The creek was a monster, a living thing that wanted to pull him down. He reached the bridge and knew at once that Mara had been right. It was impassable. The center section was already sagging, and a massive log, caught in the current, slammed against its pilings, making the whole structure groan in protest. He turned the horse, forcing it upstream, his mind racing. He knew this land, every dip and rise. There was a place, half a mile up, where the creek bed was wider and shallower, the banks made of rock instead of mud. It was his only chance. When he reached it, the sight that met him was terrifying. The water was a solid, charging sheet, but it was not as deep. He urged the horse forward, but the animal balked, its eyes rolling in terror at the roaring water. Colt dismounted. He uncoiled the rope from his saddle, its familiar texture a small comfort in his hands. He tied one end securely around the saddle horn and, holding the other, he waded into the freezing, powerful current. The water surged against him, trying to tear him from his feet. He fought for every step, his boots slipping on the slick rocks. He reached the other side, his body numb with cold, and secured the rope around the base of a large cottonwood tree. He pulled it taut, a lifeline across the flood. He went back, took the horse's reins, and, speaking to it in a low, steady voice, he led the terrified animal across, the rope his only guide in the churning darkness. He made it soaked, freezing, and exhausted. He pulled himself back into the saddle and urged the horse into a desperate, mud-splattering gallop toward the distant, flickering lights of town. Back at the ranch, time seemed to slow and stretch. Every gust of wind sounded like a cry. Every creak of the house sounded like a final, splintering collapse. Mara kept telling her story, her throat raw, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. Nora's voice grew hoarse, but she did not stop reading. Then, through the din of the storm, Mara heard it, a sound that did not belong, a rhythmic, desperate pounding. Hoofbeats. She stumbled to the door and threw it open, oblivious to the wind and rain that tore at her. 2 horses were struggling up the lane, their sides heaving. Colt, and beside him, a slighter figure, Dr. Miller. Colt was swaying in the saddle, his face a pale, ghostly mask in the lantern light. He had given his oilskin coat to the doctor. He slid from the horse's back, his legs buckling beneath him. He was at the very edge of his endurance. Mara rushed to his side, grabbing his arm, her small frame bracing his as he staggered toward the porch steps. She half carried, half dragged him over the threshold, his wet, cold body leaning heavily against hers. The doctor was already at Rosie's side, his bag open, his movements swift and professional. As he worked, a strange and wonderful thing began to happen. The rain, which had been a solid, roaring sheet, began to lessen. The wind's angry howl softened to a low, mournful sigh. And as the doctor finally administered a dose of medicine, the first faint, gray light of dawn began to seep through the window. Rosie's delirious murmuring quieted. Her breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, deepened. Her small body, which had been rigid with fever, relaxed into a true and peaceful sleep. The fever had broken. Mara looked across the room at Colt. He was slumped in a chair by the fire, his head in his hands, steam rising from his soaked clothes. The oil lamp on the table, which had been flickering all night, now burned with a bright, unwavering flame. The storm was over. She went to him and knelt by his chair. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot with exhaustion, but clear. He had done it. He had ridden through the flood, had faced down the storm, and he had won. She reached out and took his hand. It was ice cold, but his fingers closed around hers with a surprising strength. They did not speak. They did not need to. They simply knelt there, in the quiet aftermath, their hands clasped together, a silent, unbreakable bond forged in the heart of the storm. The morning of the inspection dawned unnaturally bright and clean. The world scrubbed raw by the storm. The air was cold and crisp, and every detail of the landscape stood out in sharp relief. Inside the ranch house, an equally sharp tension hummed beneath a surface of forced calm. Rosie, pale but clear-eyed, was propped up in her cot, a silent, fragile testament to the battle they had just won. The other children were scrubbed and dressed in their best mended clothes, their faces a mixture of nervousness and defiance. Just after 10, 2 riders approached. Deputy Silas Crowley, his uniform immaculate, his smile as polished and insincere as ever, and beside him, a man who was his opposite in every way. The inspector was a man named Davies, older, with a weary, stooped posture and a face etched with the lines of 1,000 difficult decisions. He looked like a man who had seen every form of human misery and was no longer surprised by any of it. He dismounted stiffly, his gaze sweeping over the ranch not with Crowley's avarice, but with a practiced, neutral scrutiny. Colt met them on the porch, Mara a step behind him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The children were arrayed in the doorway like a small, solemn honor guard. Mr. Davies introduced himself, his voice dry and businesslike. He wasted no time on pleasantries. He said, "I'm here to conduct a review of the premises and to ascertain the living conditions of the wards of the territory currently residing here. I will need to see the entire house, the pantry, the sleeping quarters, and I will need to speak with the children. Alone." The inspection was a methodical, invasive process. Davies moved through the house with a quiet thoroughness that was far more unnerving than Crowley's open hostility. He measured the distance between the cots with a small folding rule. He opened the food pantry and made a note of the sacks of flour and beans, the jars of preserved vegetables. He ran a hand along a windowsill, checking for dust. Crowley followed him like a smug shadow, a faint smirk playing on his lips, confident that this stranger would see only what he wanted him to see, an irregular, impoverished household, unfit for children. When Davies was finished with the house, he turned to the children. He asked Nora to read a passage from a book, his eyes noting her fluency. He asked Eli to show him his drawings, his expression unreadable as he studied the charcoal sketches of his family. He even coaxed a shy smile from Rosie. Then, he sat at the long kitchen table, opened a leather-bound portfolio, and looked at Colt and Mara. He said, "The house is clean, and the children appear to be in good health. Now, to the matter of your legal standing. Mr. Ransom, and the formal complaints that have been lodged against you." This was Mara's moment. She stepped forward and placed her ledger on the table. It opened with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the tense silence. She said, "Sir, if I may, we have prepared a file for your review." She presented her case with the calm, clear logic of a seasoned lawyer. She walked him through her journal, the daily record of their lives. She showed him the charts that tracked the children's growth, tangible proof of their well-being. She laid out Eli's drawings, a portfolio of a happy childhood, one by one. She presented the signed statements, May Olson's testimony to Colt's character, Dr. Miller's affidavit confirming the children's health and the excellent care they had received after their accidents, and finally, Father Abel's impassioned letter, with the petition signed by 24 citizens of Copper Creek. As Davies read, his weary expression shifted. A flicker of something akin to respect entered his eyes. He looked up at Mara, then at Colt, as if seeing them for the first time. Crowley, sensing the tide turning against him, decided to play his trump card. He stepped forward, a sheet of paper in his hand. He said, "This is all very touching, Mr. Davies, a well-rehearsed performance, but it does not change the facts. Mr. Ransom is not the legal guardian of these children. He is a rancher, and according to this sworn statement, he has been using the older children as unpaid labor, in direct violation of territorial law." He handed the paper to Davies. It was a statement, signed with a crude X, from the very rustler Colt had captured and Crowley had released. It was a venomous document, filled with lies and half-truths. claiming the rustler had personally witnessed Colt selling unbranded calves from the ranch for cash. Money that was never recorded. Money that rightfully belonged to the children as wards of the state. It painted Colt not as a savior, but as a callous exploiter, a man profiting from the labor of orphans. The accusation, so vile and so far from the truth, hung in the air like poison. Colt went rigid, a low growl of fury rumbling in his chest. Before he could speak, the front door opened. May Olson strode in, her face a thundercloud, Father Abel following in her wake. Mara had asked them to come, anticipating that Crowley would not fight fair. May slammed a heavy, leather-bound accounts ledger onto the table next to Mara's. She said, "That is a lie, and you know it. Silas Crowley. I have here a record of every transaction Colt Ransom has made at my store for the past 5 years. Every sack of flour, every piece of cloth, every bag of candy for the children." She flipped through the pages, her finger jabbing at the neat columns. "And here are the records of the cattle he has sold. Not for cash, but for trade certificates, which he used to buy supplies. It is all here. There is no secret money." Father Abel stepped forward, placing a small, worn church register on the table. He said, "And as for the children's legal standing, I have here the baptismal records for Nora and for the boy. Huck, they were found abandoned, with no known family. They are, in the eyes of God and the law, foundlings, Mr. Ransom did not take them from anyone. He took them from nothing. He gave them a name and a home where they had none." Crowley's face was a mask of fury. His legal attack was crumbling. He turned his venom on Mara. He sneered. "And what is your role in all this? Miss Quinn, the concerned teacher, or a woman looking to secure a husband and a ready-made family? You have no legal standing here. You are a temporary employee. Your interest is fleeting." The cruel words were meant to diminish her, to paint her as a transient, an outsider with no real stake in the outcome. Mara met his gaze, and all the fear she had carried for so long was burned away in a blaze of righteous anger. She turned to the inspector, but her voice was loud and clear, meant for every person in the room. She said, "My interest, Mr. Davies, is not fleeting. Deputy Crowley is right about one thing. I have no legal standing here. I am not related to these children by blood, but my commitment to them is absolute. He suggests my motives are not pure, that my presence here is temporary. So let me make my position perfectly and publicly clear." She took a deep, steadying breath, the next words tasting of old pain and new courage. She said, "I cannot have children of my own. It is a fact of my life. It is not a tragedy. It is a simple, unchangeable truth. And what that means, sir, is that when I choose to love a child, when I choose to build a family, it is not an accident of biology. It is a deliberate choice, made with everything I am. This is my family, these are my children, and I will not allow you or anyone to take them away." A profound, shocked silence filled the room. The children stared at her, their eyes wide with a new understanding. May Olson's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Davies looked at her, his weary face transformed by a look of profound respect. He then turned his gaze to Colt, who had stood silent and stoic through the entire ordeal. And in that moment, Colt Ransom spoke. His voice was not loud, but it resonated with the power and weight of absolute truth. He looked directly at Davies, but his words were a shield around his entire family. He said, "There is no bloodline here. There is duty." "Mr." Davies was silent for a long time. He looked at the mountain of paper on the table, the evidence of a community's support, the proof of a woman's fierce love, the quiet dignity of a good man. He slowly closed his portfolio. He said, "Deputy Crowley, the official notice stands, but in light of the extraordinary and conflicting testimony presented here today, I am granting a 10-day extension. I will be submitting my full report, including all of these documents and my personal recommendation, to the circuit judge in Cheyenne for a final review." He stood up, his posture seeming a little less stooped. He looked at Colt and Mara. "Good day to you." He walked out, leaving a seething Silas Crowley in his wake. Crowley shot a look of pure venom at Colt and Mara before turning to follow the inspector. As he left the porch, he paused, and in a low, furious voice, he spoke to two rough-looking men who were loitering by the corral. Mara could not hear the words, but the intent was clear. It was the whisper of a man preparing to play his final, desperate hand. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in streaks of orange and purple, Mara found Colt by the section of fence that had been damaged in the storm. He was replacing a splintered post, his movements economical and sure. The air was cool and still, the world exhausted and quiet after the day's battle. She did not speak. She simply picked up the hammer and a handful of nails and began securing the loose rails. They worked side by side in the fading light, the rhythmic tap of her hammer a counterpoint to the solid thud of his post driver. They were mending a fence, but they were also mending their world, piece by broken piece. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything that had been said, and everything that had not. It was the comfortable, steady silence of two people who had faced a storm together and had come out the other side, stronger and more certain than before. The 10-day extension was a cruel gift. It was a pocket of borrowed time, a brief, sunlit clearing before the final, looming darkness of the woods. A fragile, temporary peace settled over the ranch. The rhythm of their lives returned, but it was a melody played in a minor key, shadowed by the constant awareness of the ticking clock. They worked, they learned. They ate their meals at the long table, a family clinging to the fiction of normalcy while the threat of annihilation hung over their heads. The attack came on the third night, under the cold, indifferent light of a sliver of moon. It came not with a roar, but with a whisper. Mara awoke to a smell. It was not the familiar, comforting scent of wood smoke from the hearth, but something sharper, hungrier, acrid. She sat bolt upright in her cot, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Through the small window of her room, she saw it, a flickering, malevolent orange glow where the dark, solid shape of the hay barn should be. Fire! For a heartbeat, she was frozen, the single word a shard of ice in her mind. Then the training, the discipline, the sheer force of her will took over. She was out of her room in an instant, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the sleepy silence of the house. Colt fire. The barn. He was already moving, pulling on his boots, his face a grim, stony mask in the hellish light that now filled the windows. The roar was audible now, a hungry, devouring sound. He burst from the house, yelling for Nate and Billy, the two young hands who were stumbling from the bunkhouse, their face pale with shock. Mara's focus was singular. The children. She flew to their cots, her hands finding them in the smoky, orange-tinged darkness. Nora was already awake, her eyes wide with terror. Eli was sitting up, silent and trembling. Mara scooped a still-sleeping Rosie into her arms, the little girl's warm, limp body a precious, vulnerable weight. Everyone out, she commanded, her voice a calm, solid rock in the swirling sea of chaos. To the porch. Now. Outside. The heat was a physical blow. The hay barn was a raging inferno, a monstrous pillar of fire and smoke that clawed at the black sky, sending a blizzard of glowing embers into the wind. The terrible beauty of it was mesmerizing, but there was no time for awe. Colt was already organizing the desperate, hopeless fight, the while he roared over the fire's fury. Form a line, buckets. Nora and Eli, their fear momentarily forgotten in the face of a direct order, ran to join the bucket brigade. Nate and Billy were already there, their movements frantic. The small splashes of water they threw against the towering wall of flame seeming like a child's tears against a tidal wave. Mara gathered the younger children on the far side of the porch, as far from the heat and smoke as possible. The wind was shifting, carrying a thick, choking cloud toward the house. Rosie coughed in her sleep, a small, ragged sound that sent a fresh spike of fear through Mara. Smoke was a silent killer, as deadly as the flames themselves. Her mind, honed by years of medical training, raced. Lungs. Protect their lungs. She ran back into the house, grabbed the water bucket by the stove, and began tearing strips from a clean dishcloth. She soaked them, her movements swift and sure. She returned to the porch and pressed a damp cloth into Huck's hand. "Hold this over your mouth and nose," she ordered. "Do not take it off." She gently tied another cloth around Rosie's face, then gave one to Nora and Eli as they ran back and forth with their half-empty buckets. As she knelt to adjust Huck's cloth, her eyes caught something in the strangely illuminated mud near the porch steps. Boot prints, 2 sets. They were not the familiar, worn-down heels of Colt's boots, or the smaller prints of the hands. These were different. One had a distinctive, V-shaped notch in the heel. They were deep, purposeful tracks, leading from the direction of the road, circling the barn, and then heading back the way they came. This was no accident. This was a deliberate, calculated act of war. She organized the children into a line, a small, disciplined unit in the heart of the chaos. She said, "Huck, you will hold Rosie. Nora, Eli, you keep bringing water, but only to this end of the porch, to wet the walls of the house. We have to save the house." She gave them a purpose, a structure to contain their terror. She was not just their teacher, she was their commander, and they were her small, brave army. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the roar of the fire, a man's guttural cry of rage, followed by the sickening thud of a fist hitting flesh. Mara's head snapped toward the far side of the burning barn. In the flickering, demonic light, she saw 2 figures locked in a desperate, brutal struggle. It was Colt and one of the rustlers, the same shifty-eyed man Crowley had released. The man had clearly stayed behind to watch his handiwork. Colt was a man possessed. All the frustration, all the righteous anger he had been forced to swallow was now unleashed. He fought with a silent, terrifying fury, his fists moving like pistons. The rustler was smaller, but wiry and desperate, a cornered rat fighting for its life. He pulled a knife, its blade glinting in the firelight. Mara saw the glint of steel, and her blood ran cold. But it was not the rustler's life she feared for. It was Colt's soul. He disarmed the man with a brutal twist of the wrist, the knife flying into the darkness. He slammed the man against the corral fence, his hands closing around the man's throat. His face, illuminated by the flames, was a mask of cold, lethal rage. He was going to kill him, and Mara knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that this was exactly what Crowley wanted. He wanted to turn Colt into a killer, a violent, lawless man who could be easily dismissed and condemned. He would win. "Colt, no!" Mara screamed, her voice tearing through the roar of the flames. He did not hear her. He was lost in the red haze of his own fury. She ran toward them, her heart pounding. "Colt, stop! Don't let them turn you into the man they want you to be." Her words, raw and desperate, finally pierced his rage. He froze, his knuckles white, his entire body trembling with the effort of holding back. He looked from the sputtering, terrified man in his grasp to Mara, who was standing a few feet away, her face a pale oval in the fiery light, her eyes pleading with him. The fury in his own eyes slowly receded, replaced by a dawning, terrible understanding. He loosened his grip. The rustler slumped to the ground, gasping for air, and scrambled away into the darkness like the vermin he was. The fight went out of all of them then. The barn was a lost cause. They focused their remaining energy on saving the house, soaking the walls until the fire finally began to die down. Having consumed everything it could, dawn broke on a scene of utter devastation. The barn was a skeleton of blackened, smoldering timbers, sending a plume of foul-smelling smoke into the clean morning air. The ground was a churned morass of mud and ash. Their winter supply of hay was gone. The seed they had stored for the spring planting was gone. Their financial future had been reduced to cinders. They were huddled on the porch, a small, soot-stained band of survivors, when a lone rider approached. It was Silas Crowley. He was freshly shaved, his clothes clean, his horse well-groomed. He looked like a man who had enjoyed a good night's sleep. He surveyed the ruin with a look of practiced sympathy that did not touch his eyes. "A terrible tragedy," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "An accident. I presume a stray spark." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. This is a terrible blow, especially now. An inspector seeing this, it does not look good. A ranch that cannot protect its own assets is hardly a stable environment for children. He dismounted and walked to the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at them. "But I am a reasonable man. I have spoken with the railroad. In light of your misfortune, they are willing to make a final offer. A charitable one, you might say. A small sum, enough to get you through the winter, in exchange for the deed to the land along the creek. And if you accept, I will personally see to it that the inspector's report is favorable. I will drop the investigation. You can keep the children. You just have to be reasonable." It was the final, brutal turn of the screw. He had burned them out, and now he was offering to save them from the fire he had set. For a price. The price of their future. No one spoke. The children just stared, their small faces smudged with soot and exhaustion. Colt stood like a statue carved from stone, his expression unreadable. That evening, the family sat on the smoke-stained porch steps, the stench of wet ash hanging heavy in the cool air. The devastating reality of their situation had settled in. They were ruined, defeated. Colt, who had been silent for hours, finally spoke. His voice was low, rough with emotion. He was not looking at anyone, but at the blackened bones of his barn. He said, "When I saw those flames, my first thought was the hay, the seed, the money, everything we needed to survive." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick. "I was wrong. When I saw you, Mara, pulling Rosie from the smoke, when I saw all of you, I knew I was more afraid of losing this chosen family than I ever was of losing the land." He finally turned his head and looked at Mara. The confession, the raw, painful vulnerability in his eyes, cracked her heart wide open. All the walls, all the defenses, crumbled to dust. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple, profound gesture of shared weariness, of shared belonging. "If we can keep the house in our hearts," she whispered, her voice a quiet promise in the twilight, "we can rebuild the one outside." A small movement from under the porch bench broke the spell. Huck slowly emerged, his face a comical mask of soot, clutched in his arms, blinking in the fading light. Was one of the hens from the coop, its white feathers streaked with black. "She was hiding," Huck announced, his voice filled with a solemn sense of discovery. "She is a smoked chicken now." The image was so absurd, so perfectly, heartbreakingly resilient, that a sound bubbled up from Mara's chest. It was a laugh, a watery, grief-stricken laugh, but a laugh nonetheless. Then Colt let out a low chuckle, a rough, rusty sound. Soon, Nora and Eli were giggling, a cascade of pure, childish relief. They sat there, amidst the ruins of their life, and laughed through their tears, a small, defiant island of hope in a sea of ashes. Later, after the children were finally asleep inside the house, Mara took a small cloth bag from her satchel. It held a handful of dried beans she had saved for the next lesson. She walked to the small, tilled patch of their vegetable garden, near the fence they had mended together. She knelt in the damp earth, next to a post that was scorched and blackened from the fire. With her finger, she poked a small hole in the soil, one by one. She dropped the beans into the earth, a small, foolish, desperate act of faith, planting seeds in the shadow of a ruin. Colt came and stood silently behind her. He did not ask what she was doing. He understood. She stood and turned to face him in the darkness. Their promise did not need to be spoken aloud. It was in the air they breathed, in the ground beneath their feet. No sellin' the creek, no sellin' the family. The church, which also served as Copper Creek's town hall, was a simple, honest building of stripped pine, and it was filled to bursting. The entire town, it seemed, had come to witness the final act of the long, slow siege on Ransom Ranch. They sat on the hard wooden pews, their faces a tense sea of curiosity, sympathy, and suspicion. Mara walked down the center aisle with Colt at her side, the children trailing behind them like a small, determined flock. Nora's head was held high. Eli's hand was clutching Colt's, and Huck and Rosie were a wide-eyed, silent pair between them. They were not just a family on trial. They were a public spectacle, their private lives laid bare for the judgment of strangers. At the front, seated behind a makeshift table, was Inspector Davies, his face as weary and impartial as ever. To one side sat Silas Crowley, a picture of smug confidence, a sheaf of papers neatly arranged before him. Beside him sat a man Mara recognized with a jolt of cold dread. It was one of the rustlers who had escaped into the darkness on the night of the fire. The hearing began with a dry recitation of facts from Davies. He summarized his findings, the condition of the ranch, and the conflicting testimonies he had already received. Then he gave the floor to Crowley. The deputy rose, his voice smooth and persuasive. He spoke of the importance of law and order, of the sacred trust of caring for the territory's orphans. He painted a picture of Colt Ransom as a well-meaning but ultimately unfit guardian, a man living outside the bounds of civilized society. Then he called his witness. The rustler, a man named Jed, slouched to the front. He would not meet Colt's eyes. Under Crowley's gentle, leading questions, he spun a tale of neglect and exploitation. He claimed he had worked for a time at the ranch and had seen with his own eyes how Ransom overworked the children, how he sold off cattle for cash, and how the place was a dangerous, unstable environment. It was a performance, a string of carefully constructed lies. But in the sterile silence of the hearing, the words had weight. A low murmur of doubt rippled through the pews. When it was Colt's turn to speak, he simply stood. He said, "Everything that man said is a lie." Davies looked at him, his expression impassive. He said, "Do you have any evidence to refute his claims? Mr. Ransom, any witness to speak on your behalf?" Before Colt could answer, the church doors creaked open. May Olson stood there, her account ledger clutched to her chest like a shield. She walked down the aisle with the determined stride of a woman on a mission. She said, her voice ringing with indignation, "I am a witness." She placed her ledger on the table with a thud that made Crowley flinch. "This man, Jed, has never worked a day at the Ransom Ranch, but he has done business with Silas Crowley. Last month, Jed sold the deputy 3 head of cattle for cash, far below market value. A very strange transaction, I thought, for a man with no ranch of his own. I made a note of it, right here." She opened the book, her finger tracing a line in the neat, spidery script of her accounts. The room was silent, every eye fixed on the ledger. Davies leaned forward, his interest piqued. May continued, her voice rising. "And it is also strange that Deputy Crowley, a man on a public salary, has had enough spare cash these past months to pay off a considerable gambling debt to a freight driver from Cheyenne. I know, because the driver uses the money to buy supplies at my store. It is all in the book." Crowley was on his feet, his face a mottled, furious red. He sputtered, "This is an outrage, Slander. This woman's scribblings are not evidence." As if on cue, the doors opened again. A second figure stood silhouetted against the bright morning light. He was gaunt, his clothes ragged and stained with soot. It was the other rustler, the one Colt had nearly killed, the one who had fled into the night. He walked slowly down the aisle, his eyes fixed on Mara. He stopped before the table. His voice was a low, rough rasp. He said, "What she said is true. Jed and me, we stole them calves. Crowley paid us to do it." A collective gasp went through the room. Crowley looked as if he had been struck by lightning. The man turned his gaze to Davies. He said, "And the fire? That was us, too. Crowley paid us for that, as well. Said to make it look like an accident. Said to scare the man into selling his land." Davies looked at the man. His eyes narrowed. He asked, "Why are you confessing to this now you are admitting to a serious crime?" The man's gaze flickered back to Mara. He said, "Because when that barn was coming down, a burnin' beam fell. I was trapped. Thought I was a goner. And she—" He nodded toward Mara. "She was getting the little ones out, but she saw me. She did not know who I was. She just yelled, 'This way, the smoke is thinner this way.' She could have let me burn. She should have, but she did not." He took a ragged breath. He said, "I ain't a good man, but I ain't the kind of man who lets a good woman's kindness get repaid with a prison sentence for her family. Crowley is the one who belongs behind bars." The confession, raw and undeniable, shattered Crowley's world. The room erupted in a furious buzz of conversation. Davies slammed a small wooden gavel on the table, the sharp crack restoring a fragile order. He looked at Crowley, his face a mask of cold disgust. His verdict was swift and decisive. He said, "Based on this new testimony, I am hereby granting temporary guardianship of all 5 children to Mr. Colt Ransom, pending a full review by the Circuit Court. I am also submitting a formal recommendation that he be granted permanent custody. As for you, Mr. Crowley, you are under investigation for corruption, conspiracy, and arson. You will turn over your badge and your weapon." The fall was as swift as it was total. 2 sturdy townsmen escorted a pale, trembling Crowley from the church. In the stunned silence that followed, a well-dressed man in a city suit, who had been sitting quietly at the back, approached the table. He introduced himself as a representative of the Northern and Plains Railroad. He looked at Colt, his expression purely business. He said, "Mr. Ransom, it seems our arrangement with Mr. Crowley was misguided. We have no interest in this local drama. We have an interest in water." He gestured to a map. "We are prepared to move the proposed site for the water tank a half-mile downstream, off your property line. In return, we would be willing to offer you a long-term contract to supply our work crews with beef and our engines with hay from your pastures. A mutually beneficial arrangement." It was over. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, practical negotiation. They had not just won, they had been integrated, on their own terms, into the very future that had threatened to destroy them. That evening, the air at the ranch was still and clear. The children, giddy with a relief they could not fully articulate, were engaged in a wild game of tag around the skeleton of the burned-out barn. Colt and Mara stood by the creek, watching the water slip peacefully over the smooth stones. The public victory felt hollow without a private one to anchor it. Colt stared into the moving water, his face shadowed and thoughtful. He said, his voice low, "I never told you why I started taking in the children." Mara waited, her heart suddenly still. He said, "I was like them, not an orphan, but close enough. My father was a hard man. This ranch was his whole world. When I was 15, he died, left me this place. I was alone. I did not know how to talk to people, did not know how to be anything but a rancher. For years, it was just me and the cattle, a quiet, lonely life. And then Nora showed up, a baby, left in a basket at the church. Father Abel did not know what to do with her, and I saw myself. I saw a life that was going to be as lonely as mine had been. So I took her. I owed her a better start than I had, and after her, the others just found their way here. Every time I took one in, I felt like I was paying back a debt to that lonely boy I used to be." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a raw, aching vulnerability. He said, "But I was still alone. Mara, in a house full of people. I was still alone. Until you came." The simple, honest confession was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. All her life, she had been running from a feeling of being broken, of being incomplete. She had come west to disappear, to find a place where she could be safely alone with her sorrow. She looked at the house, at the children's figures darting in the twilight, at this quiet, stubborn man who had built a family out of duty and kindness, and she knew, with an absolute certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was no longer running. She said, her voice thick with emotion, "I could go anywhere now. The whole world is open, but I do not want to go anywhere. I want to come home. Here." He simply stared at her, as if he could not quite believe the words. He led her to the massive old cottonwood tree that stood by the creek, its branches a familiar, protective canopy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple object. It was a ring, a plain band of hammered copper, its surface glowing with a warm, rosy light. He said, "The blacksmith made it for me." From the copper strapping on the boiler that exploded, he said it was time something good came from all that destruction. He held it out to her. His hand was trembling slightly. He said, "I am not a man of fancy words, Mara, but I know this. I want to spend the rest of my life making sure that every morning you wake up, you know you are needed, you are chosen, and you are loved." Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. She held out her hand, and he slipped the warm copper ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He did not kiss her then. He simply took her face in his large, gentle hands and rested his forehead against hers. It was a kiss of the soul, a silent, profound promise. Then he lowered his head and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of arrival, a quiet, certain, and absolute homecoming. From the direction of the house, a sudden burst of joyous, unrestrained laughter from the children echoed through the twilight. A perfect, life-affirming chorus. Later, as a full moon rose over the valley, they sat on the porch steps. A new peace had settled over the ranch, a deep, quiet contentment. Huck emerged from the house, dragging a small, battered banjo. He sat on the top step and began to play, his small fingers fumbling with the strings, producing a tune that was wildly, wonderfully out of key. Colt stood and held out his hand to Mara. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet, and there, on the porch of their home, bathed in the soft silver moonlight, to the clumsy, heartfelt music of a small boy's banjo, they began to dance. A slow, gentle sway, a perfect, imperfect end to a long and difficult journey. The official papers arrived from Cheyenne 2 weeks later, carried by a circuit rider who seemed relieved to hand them over and be on his way. The document was crisp and formal, filled with the dense, unforgiving language of the law. But its meaning was as clear and bright as the spring morning. The Territorial Circuit Court had reviewed Inspector Davies's comprehensive report and had seen fit to ratify his recommendation. Permanent, undisputed guardianship of Nora, Eli, Huck, and Rosie was granted to Mr. Colt Ransom, and beneath his name, in a script that made Mara's heart leap, was a second line. Co-guardian, responsible for matters of education, health, and general welfare, Mrs. Mara Quinn Ransom. The hyphen, that small, straight line of ink, was a bridge connecting two lonely histories into a single, shared future. Their wedding was not an event so much as a continuation of the life they had already built. There was no white lace, no grand pronouncements. Father Abel performed the ceremony under the wide, open sky, with the great old cottonwood tree as their cathedral. The pews were benches and chairs carried from the house and the town, arranged in a ragged semicircle in the yard. The decorations were bunches of wild primrose and bluebells the children had picked that morning, their stems still damp with dew. May Olson, her face beaming, had baked a great golden sheet of cornbread, its edges slightly charred and a little uneven, which she declared a proper wedding cake for honest, hard-working folk. The children, scrubbed clean and fidgeting with excitement, acted as a chaotic but heartfelt wedding party. Nora and Eli walked on either side of Mara, their small hands clutching hers, solemnly leading her the 10 feet from the porch steps to where Colt waited. Huck was the ring-bearer. the simple copper band tied to a piece of twine and clutched in his fist with the fierce concentration of a boy guarding a sacred treasure. And Rosie, in a moment of pure, unscripted grace, toddled ahead, scattering a handful of dandelion fluff into the wind like a blessing. Colt did not wear a suit, but his best clean shirt. He stood waiting for her, his stormy eyes clear and steady. And when she reached him, he took her hand, his familiar, calloused grip a silent vow that was more powerful than any words. As they exchanged their simple promises, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood, a soft, natural benediction on their union. Life settled into a new, stronger rhythm, one underwritten by the quiet confidence of permanence. The porch was and always would be the schoolhouse, but now it felt less like a temporary arrangement and more like a proper institution. Its curriculum a mix of reading, writing, and the practical lessons of ranch life. Mara, with her new legal standing, expanded her role. She cleared out a small, unused room off the kitchen and turned it into a tidy infirmary. It was a simple space, with a clean cot, a stock of bandages, and rows of neatly labeled jars of salves and tinctures she made from herbs gathered in the hills. Travelers on the trail, cowboys with branding iron burns, and homesteaders' children with fevers soon learned that a steady, knowledgeable hand could be found at the ransom place. The fire had taken their savings, but it had not taken their spirit. Colt, with a quiet ingenuity, turned his skill with leather into a new form of currency. He spent his evenings not just mending his own tack, but crafting new saddles, bridles, and harnesses, their quality known throughout the territory. He traded his work not for cash, but for the things they needed most. A finely tooled saddle for a wagon load of winter hay from a neighboring ranch. A set of sturdy harnesses for sacks of seed corn and potatoes. They were rebuilding their world, piece by piece, through the strength of their own two hands and the goodwill of a community that had seen them through the fire. One afternoon in late autumn, as the first truly cold winds swept down from the mountains, Mara sat by the hearth, a familiar weight in her lap. The blue wool shawl, set aside during the turmoil and the rebuilding, was finally finished. The last stitch had been cast, the last loose end woven in. It was a simple, sturdy garment, its rows of even stitches a quiet testament to patience and perseverance. Rosie, shivering from a sudden chill, came to stand by the fire. Mara stood, and with a gentle, loving motion, she wrapped the soft, warm shawl around the little girl's shoulders. Rosie snuggled into its warmth, the vibrant blue a splash of color against the gray day. The circle was complete. A promise made in the darkness of a sick room was now a tangible, comforting warmth. Later that week, while weeding the small vegetable garden, Mara paused by the blackened, scorched fence post that still stood as a grim reminder of the fire. And there, pushing their way through the dark, rich earth, were a dozen tiny, bright green shoots. The beans she had planted in an act of blind faith, in the very shadow of their ruin, had taken root. They were alive. They were growing. News of Silas Crowley traveled slowly. A piece of gossip delivered by May Olson along with a sack of flour. He had been formally discharged from his duties, disgraced and indicted by a territorial grand jury. He had left town in the middle of the night, a diminished figure stripped of his power and his pride. The railroad, true to its word, had built its water station downstream. The trains now passed in the distance, their whistles a lonely, mournful sound, a reminder not of a personal evil, but of an impersonal world, a world of contracts in progress and systems that could crush a family without ever knowing its name. They had not defeated a monster. They had simply endured, and by enduring, had forced the world to make a space for them. One evening, as the whole family sat on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky, Huck, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally asked the question that had clearly been on his mind. He looked up at Colt, his face serious. "Now that Miss Mara is a ransom," he said, "does that mean the herd got bigger?" Colt looked at Mara, a slow, warm smile spreading across his face. a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He reached out and put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "It has," he said, his voice a low, happy rumble. "We added a heart that knows how to knit." The children laughed, and Mara leaned her head against his shoulder, the copper ring on her finger warm against her skin. The restless, aching void she had carried inside her for so long was gone. She had not given birth to a child, but she had given birth to a home, had breathed life into a family. And Colt, the silent, solitary man who had spoken only the language of duty, had learned to speak the language of the heart. He had learned to say the words that needed to be said. The days softened into a golden spring. The red dust of the long, hard journey had settled. The new barn, built with the help of their neighbors, stood strong and solid. The small, tin weather vane on its roof spun in the gentle breeze, its soft, metallic clatter a peaceful, domestic sound. As the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold, the entire family stood before the door of their house. Colt's hand was in Mara's, and their hands were linked with Nora's and Eli's, forming a small, unbreakable chain. Huck stood on Colt's other side, and Rosie was held securely in his strong arm. They did not speak. They did not need to. They simply stood together, a silent, powerful silhouette against the fading light, their faces turned toward the future. They had been chosen. They belonged. Tomorrow there would be fences to mend, lessons to teach, and a hard, beautiful life to be lived. But tonight, there was only this, a family, whole and at peace, home at last. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.